American foreign policy throughout the 1920s and 30s. After fighting in World War I on the Allied side, America returned to a policy of isolationism after the war. This meant that although the USA continued to trade with other countries, it did not get involved in any quarrels which they thought may result in war. They followed a policy of isolationism for several reasons. They firstly had the memory of the First World War and the huge suffering that it had caused as a result. They had many economic problems led by the Depression after the Wall Street crash that still needed to be dealt with. Involvement in foreign European countries may also result in problems further in their economy. They had a distrust and dislike of Europeans who seemed to get involved in various conflicts, and the Americans wanted to make sure that they stayed out of conflicts that were far away from them and really had nothing to do with them. The USA were protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific, so they could actually afford to go it alone if needed. In practice, this meant that America did not join the League of Nations in the 1920s, even though the League had been Woodrow Wilson's idea. They passed a series of neutrality acts throughout the 1930s which limited how much trade the US could do with countries at war. The USA did not enter the war in 1939 when the Second World War started, but isolation was not complete. The USA led disarmament meetings. It signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, which renounced war as a means of settling disputes, and throughout the 1920s and 30s it lent money to European countries. It also became increasingly involved with negotiations with Japan, and in 1929 it signed the Naval Pact, which meant and attended the Washington conferences, which meant that Japan and America agreed to reduce its naval influence in the world. Why did America go to war in 1941? President Roosevelt wanted to join the war from the start, but public opinion was against it. As a democracy, the Americans did not approve of Hitler and the Nazis. Roosevelt warned that if Britain and the Royal Navy were destroyed, then America could be next. However, on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese Air Force attacked an American fleet moored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was an unprovoked attack as America was not officially at war with Japan. 2,343 Americans were killed, and the American public were outraged. America immediately entered the war. Before entering the war, however, the Lend-Lease scheme allows Britain to buy now and pay later on armaments being supplied by America. Americans did not, however, sell armaments to Germany. After entering the war, America provided huge military might in men and resources, and improved morale of the Allied soldiers. America led the Pacific campaign against the Japanese, and American forces played a key role with Great Britain in the D-Day landings. America ended the war by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was seen as a method of demonstrating to the Japanese the supreme might of the Americans. Unlike Europe, America emerged from the war stronger and richer than she was before, and now she became a superpower. The Yalta Conference, 1945. The conference was held between the 4th and the 11th of February 1945. During this conference they discussed the reorganization of post-war Europe. The main purpose, though, was to help re-establish the nations destroyed by Germany during the war. At Yalta it was agreed to divide Germany into 3 sections, controlled by each of the 3 nations present: America, the Soviet Union, and Britain. It decided that Russia would take Berlin and control the eastern half of Germany, as it had the largest army. It decided that France would become one of the occupiers, although Stalin initially resisted. Poland returned its independence and given a national election to create an independent government, and Yugoslavia was also to be given its own government. The Nazi and fascist leaders specifically were prohibited. The United States, Russia and Great Britain gave themselves supreme authority to take any steps deemed necessary to prevent any future German aggression. The Yalta Agreement was signed by Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill on the 11th of February 1945. The Potsdam Conference, 1945. This conference confirmed the decisions reached at Yalta. It was decided that Germany was divided into 4 zones, each occupied by one of the 4 allies: Britain, France, the USA and the Soviet Union. The allies aimed to reunite Germany as soon as the country was strong enough. Berlin was also to be divided into 4 sections, even though it was inside the Soviet zone. Nazi leaders would be put on trial. However, there were also disagreements. The United States wanted to help arrange free elections in the Soviet-occupied areas. Stalin disagreed. The meeting broke up without agreement being made on this issue. These disagreements were caused by change in people and situations. Stalin was the only leader present at both conferences. Churchill had been replaced by Attlee, Roosevelt had died and was replaced by Truman, who had deep mistrust for the Soviet Union. The ending of the war meant that the Allies no longer had a common goal. Old differences and suspicions returned. The USA tested the first atomic bomb behind Stalin's back on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this meant that there was great distrust on Stalin's part. The Red Army still occupied the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated, and leaders chosen by Stalin controlled these governments of these countries until free elections could be held. The differences eventually led to a build-up of distrust and suspicion between the USA and the USSR. The breakdown of the alliance that had existed between them during the Second World War was now over, and this led to the beginning of the Cold War. Why was there a Cold War? At the beginning of 1945, the USA and the USSR were close allies in the war against Nazi Germany, but each grew suspicious of the other. By 1948, a series of actions and reactions by the two superpowers meant that they were virtual enemies, almost at war in the skies over Berlin. A Cold War had begun, which would last for another 40 years. Why did Stalin mistrust the Western democracies? Firstly, as a communist, Stalin saw capitalism as the ideological enemy. Secondly, Russia had been invaded from the West in 1812, 1854, 1914, 1919, and 1941. Stalin believed that Britain and the USA had delayed invading Normandy until 1944, so that the USSR would wear down the Nazi forces first. The USA possessed the atomic bomb and had dropped it on Japan in 1945, with little warning to the USSR. This demonstrated a complete neglect to show your allies' support. Why did the Western powers mistrust the USSR? Firstly, the Western democracies feared the spread of communism. Secondly, Western leaders knew of Stalin's brutal rule of his own people throughout the 1930s. The USSR's huge army of 6 million was considered to be a threat, especially as the Western armies had been disbanded quickly after the war had ended. And finally, the USSR were already occupying large parts of Central Europe. It's demonstrated that communism was spreading and that Stalin was distrusting the Western allies enough to trust them with what he intended to do next.